Section 79 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 9, Chapter 1, Part 11, Conclusion, Decadence and Extinction. It would carry us too far from our subject to recount in detail the extravagancies and follies with which the triumphant liberals invited the cruel reaction that awaited them. Moderation perhaps was scarce to be expected of men smarting under the persecution of the last 6 years, and suddenly brought from fortresses and presidios, or from exile, to take charge of the government and to frame laws for the nation. That they should in turn persecute their persecutors was natural, but impolitic. Mutual hatreds were inflamed, and the land was divided into factions between which harmony and forbearance became impossible. The long centuries of despotism and the repression of independent thought and action had rendered the people incapable of the large measure of self-government provided by the Constitution. So-called patriotic societies were rapidly formed: de Lorenzini, de San Fernando, la Fontana de Oro, la Cruz de Malta, la Landa Burana, and others, which in reality were Jacobinical clubs, where the most radical measures were advocated and the most violent means of effecting them were urged. An unbridled press was busy in adding fuel to the flames and in stimulating the ardor which sought to realize anarchical dreams. Masonry had been busy in preparing the revolution, and with its success Masonry became the avenue to power and place. Its lodges multiplied and were rapidly filled. Then, with the progress of advanced ideas, Masonry became too conservative for the exaltados, who left it and established the comuneros, whose statutes formed a state of revolutionary character within the state. They rivaled the Masons in numbers and influence, and the virulent struggle for supremacy between the two bodies at times paralyzed the government and neutralized the forces of order. The disorderly element existing in all communities was utilized whenever there was an object to be gained, and mob rule became of frequent occurrence, not only in Madrid, but in nearly all the cities. The orders of the government were obeyed or disregarded as suited the temper of the populace or of its instigators. Officials commissioned as captains general or governors or magistrates were admitted or rejected. Orderly administration was becoming impossible, and everywhere turbulence reigned supreme. Liberalism was committing suicide. Yet liberalism had need of its undivided strength to maintain itself against the opposing forces. Fernando, while playing the part of a constitutional king, was constantly plotting to throw off the yoke, and was entertaining secret relations with those who were striving to overthrow the government. Successive Cortes seemed to take pleasure in exacerbating the hostility of the clergy, whose influence over the mass of the people was unbounded. Much of this legislation was, no doubt, salutary in itself, but at the moment it was dangerous, and the blows succeeded each other so rapidly that the sufferers might well regard it as systematic persecution. August 31, 1820, a law organizing the national army exempted from service only such clerics as were actually in holy orders. One of September 26th subjected all clerics, secular and regular, to secular jurisdiction, for offences incurring corporal punishment. Within a week, another decree suppressed a large portion of the monastic orders, and the mendicants who were left were subjected to the bishops, and consolidated into houses of not less than 12 inmates, and this was followed by other special decrees of suppression. The property of the suppressed houses was applied to the credito publico, and when Fernando refused his signature, a popular tumult was organized, which frightened him into acquiescence. October 26th, it was ordered that dispensations for marriage within prohibited degrees should be issued without charge to those applying in forma pauperis, thus cutting off a large source of income. When bands of insurgent royalists began to make their appearance and were joined or led by priests, the bishops were ordered April 20, 1821, to report what steps they had taken to punish them, and within 8 days to issue edicts requiring their flocks to obey the law. Then, on June 29th, without papal authority, a contribution of 30 million reals was levied on the clergy, and on the same day the tithes were reduced 1/2, while allowing some compensation in the removal of certain imposts. The clergy, not unnaturally, promoted disaffection, and to check this, decrees of November 1, 1822, authorized the government at discretion to transfer from one place to another all parish priests and ecclesiastics, the cost of maintenance of those thus deported being thrown upon the bishops. In fact, the irreconcilable claims of state and church rendered hostility inevitable. It was impossible for the latter to understand that when it entered politics and became a political factor, it had to be treated like other political bodies. The theocracy of the Middle Ages had so long enjoyed power without responsibility that its immunity became part of Latin doctrine. Elsewhere, the impracticability of this had been demonstrated, but in Spain the Church has never ceased to struggle for the maintenance of medievalism, or has understood that sedition in the pulpit should not be treated differently from sedition in the tribune. It refused to recognize that self-preservation is the first law of governments as of individuals, and that they cannot allow artificial privileges to work their destruction. The theory of the liberals was that external ecclesiastical discipline was subject to the civil authority, while internal discipline was reserved to the Church. The Church asserted that in all things it ruled itself, and that any secular interference was a laying of profane hands on the ark. The gauge of battle was virtually thrown by Veremundo Arias, Archbishop of Valencia, who, on October 20, 1820, addressed to the Cortes a long manifesto upholding all the extreme claims of the Church and denying the distinction between external and internal discipline. On November 10th he was arrested, and on the 24th was put on board ship and sent to France. This was the commencement of a persecution in which many bishops suffered. Alvarez de Palma of Granada was set aside and replaced by the liberal archpriest Vinegas. Uriz y la Faga of Pampeluna was summoned to Madrid, but, on the road, was rescued by royalists and conveyed to France. Blas Beltran of Coria was banished. The bishop-elect of Santa Marta, Colombia, received his sentence of exile on his deathbed in Plasencia. Cienfuegos of Cádiz had to fly to save his life. Pablo de Sichar of Barcelona fled and remained absent until 1823. Renteria y Reyes of Lerida was carried under guard to Barcelona, narrowly escaped execution, and was detained in Malaga until 1823. Ramon Stroch y Vidal of Vich was imprisoned in Barcelona, then sent to Tarragona, and on the road, under a pretext, was made to descend and was shot with his attendant. Others who were exiled were Jaime Creus of Tarragona, Ceruelo de la Fuente of Oviedo, Rafael de Velez of Ceuta, and Castillon y Salas of Tarazona. It is true that the worst of these acts were committed by mobs or irresponsible parties in the growing disorders of the times, but they remained unrebuked and unpunished. A government which thus treated its clergy was not likely to maintain friendly relations with the Holy See. One of the earliest measures of the new government was an act of August 17, 1820, suppressing the Jesuits. Pius VII met this with a letter of September 16th to Fernando, deploring the perils that threatened religion and the church and reciting the obnoxious measures taken, for which he had ordered his nuncio to make reclamation, but without effect. Relations were not improved when, April 21, 1821, a decree suppressed all payments, whether in money or other equivalent, for papal bulls for archbishops, bishops, matrimonial dispensations, and other rescripts, in lieu of which the paltry annual sum of 9,000 silver dollars was offered. This was unwise, but still more so was the sending to Rome as ambassador of Joaquin Lorenzo Villanueva towards the close of 1822, when the intervention of the Holy Alliance was impending. At Turin he was met by a papal order forbidding him to come further, and asking the ministry to appoint someone else. Evaristo San Miguel, the Secretary of State, insisted. The papal foreign secretary replied that the opinions expressed by Villanueva in the Cartas de Don Roque Leal and in the Cortes were such that the Holy See could never receive him. To this the answer was to send the nuncio his passports with orders to leave Spain. The rupture with Rome was complete, and in the eyes of pious Spaniards the government had justified the clerical definition of the Constitution as heresy. The clerical temper thus stimulated is fairly exhibited in a little pamphlet by Padre Miguel Canto, parish priest of Calosa de Segura, celebrating the downfall of constitutionalism. He is fairly drunk with joy, and consigns the liberals to the bottomless pit for eternity with vigorous delight. That the civil power should dare to assume any control over the externals of the Church fills him with astonishment and rage, all the greater in view of the suffering which it inflicted, especially on the regulars. Canto tells us that the fabric of his church had enjoyed a revenue of 4,000 pesos, and that it was reduced to such poverty that he had not wherewith to provide wafers and wine for the sacrament or oil for the lamps. Yet the resources of the Spanish Church were such that it still had ample funds for political uses. When, in October 1823, after his release by the French, Fernando travelled from Cadiz to Madrid, he received in voluntary offerings from the chapters of Toledo, Seville, Granada, Jaen, and Cuenca 11,970,000 reals in silver, although the land was in a condition of complete exhaustion. It is not difficult to believe that the pulpit and the confessional were energetically used to inflame and organize the disaffection that rapidly succeeded to the enthusiasm for the Constitution. The new administration was no more efficient than the old. Ministries, hampered with the underhand intrigues of the king, perpetually guarding against eager rivals, and speedily engrossed with suppressing the armed resistance springing up on every hand, had little opportunity of rectifying the abuses which had made Fernando unpopular. To the people at large, the only visible result of the revolution was that the liberals in turn were persecuting the serviles. The nobles, moreover, were alienated by the suppression of mayorazgos and vinculaciones, or entails and perpetual charges on lands, a reform which had long been urged by statesmen such as Jovellanos. Willing and receptive listeners to clerical invective were abundant, and movements to overthrow the government speedily began taking shape. Before the year 1820 was out, in Galicia there was organized a junta apostolica, and in Burgos there was a crazy conspiracy of some frailes and a general. Soon wandering bands of insurgents sprang up, among whom members of the clergy were conspicuous, as though it was a holy war. Suppressed in one place, they appeared in another, waging a guerrilla warfare like that against Napoleon. The land was torn with faction, and liberals and royalists seemed to emulate each other in contributing to its ruin. Early in July 1822, the royal guards, with the secret connivance of the king, endeavored to gain possession of Madrid, after a sanguinary conflict in the streets, they were defeated when Fernando, from a balcony of his palace, stimulated the nationals in pursuit of the flying wretches. Civil broils are apt to be pitiless, but in Spain they assumed a ferocity not often witnessed elsewhere. If the royalists in Catalonia massacred in cold blood the garrison of the Seo de Urgel, a liberal noyade in Coruña dispatched 51 political prisoners, many of them ecclesiastics and persons of distinction. The revolt was constantly assuming proportions more alarming, especially in Catalonia, where it had the almost unanimous support of the peasantry. The insurrectionary bands coalesced into a force of 5,000 men, styling itself the Army of the Faith, which, on June 21, 1822, captured the Seo de Urgel and made it their stronghold. There, on August 15th, was organized a royalist regency composed of Creus, the exiled archbishop of Tarragona, the Baron of Eroles, a soldier of some reputation, and the Marquis of Mataflorida. The counter-revolution thus adopted a public and official character. The regency assumed to speak for the king, held in durance by the Jacobins. In fact, as early as June 1st, he had authorized Mataflorida to organize it, and was in constant communication with it through one of the officials of the court. It obtained quasi-recognition abroad. It negotiated a loan of 8 million with the Parisian capitalist Ouvrat, and, with the support of Pius VII, it opened negotiations with Austria and Russia, offering surrenders of territory in exchange for aid. End of section 79. Recording by Linda Johnson.